今天是2021年8月1号啊，这个是台湾时间，美国时间应该也是8月1号啊，我们是晚上，你们是早上啊。今天讲世界相续啊。
Today is August 1st, both in Taiwan and in the US. It's nighttime here, but in Taiwan, and daytime over there in New York. And today we're going to continue our talk, and today's focus will be on the continuation of the world.
那今天讲世界相续，还是要延续啊，从这个最早的啊，也就是说，我们本来是没有什么，没有，就是只有我们叫什么觉性啊本身。那因为从真起妄啊，那才产生这一些我们说虚空世界众生灭果啊。那也就是说这些我们这些世界啊，还有包括我们这身体，都是心变现的，这个非常重要。
So, to continue the talk on the continuation of the world, we have to first trace back to the beginning and review briefly. Essentially, fundamentally, there has always been our Buddha nature, this awareness. And because of our deluded thinking, this duality thinking, then we become confused. Confusion arises, delusion arises from our true nature, true awareness. And thus giving rise then to empty space, the world, sentient beings, and karma. So it's very important to continuously keep in mind that the world, our physical body, these are all created from the mind, by the mind.
那在我们的生活经验我们很难相信说这个世界还有这个身体是我心变现的那楞严经他讲背后的道理那我们在现实生活当中可能就借助某一些人的经验来说明这个世界那这些甚至这些物质是我们心变现的
Our everyday experience, if that's the sole basis of our understanding, it's hard to really grasp the concept. Why is it that you are saying the world and the body and mind, they're all created by the mind? That's not what our daily experience tells us. But this is what is explained in the Surangama Sutra. The principles are laid down in the sutra. So in order for us to comprehend these principles, we need to rely on other people's experience or their teaching, helping us understand the concept, why our mind and the world and our physical body are all created by the mind.
那我想在每个人生活经验当中应该都可以说我们晚上睡觉那我们这个世界或者说我们这个眼睛所看到的当然是眼睛所看到的包括触觉的世界主要是眼睛所看到的我们这些山河大地像房间像现在我坐在房间里面我只要眼睛一闭睡着了那对我来讲在当时这个世界这个房间就这个世界就消失了
Even in our everyday experience, we can develop some inklings about the principles explained in the Surangama Sutra. For instance, when we fall asleep at night, the world that is perceived by the eyes that we see, the world that we see, or even sensation that tactilely, the world that we feel tactilely, our room, for instance, or the larger world, as soon as our eyes is closed and we fall asleep, everything has fallen away and has disappeared for us.
然后这一个，除了这个以外，可能现在也有一些人，就是说，比如说用念力然后把这个铁的汤匙，把它什么弄成那个什么，这个弄成这什么，什么麻花是吧？把它剪成一个那种螺旋形的就是用念力。那他们可以表演，可是他们说不出背后的道理如果你懂楞严经了，其实它就是心性的变现
We can also see other examples. For instance, there are people who have ESP, and we have seen them in documentaries or see them bending metal spoons, for instance. They can use their thought to twist the spoon into a spiral shape. And these people they are able to perform the task, yet they have difficulty explaining the principle behind it. And this is exactly what we're getting at. If you understand that everything is created by the mind, then it will be easier to explain this concept.
在我们平常的生活当中就我们想到什么想到某某人张三李四想到妈妈，想到你的老师那你就会发觉，那就从我的记忆中里面拉出这个影像，那很明显的那这个影像就是从我们叫无中生有那这样就是我们心变现的。
And in our everyday experience, we can also have this experience where whatever you think of, maybe you are thinking of your mom or thinking of your friend, whoever you think of, you can immediately retrieve the memory of this. You can retrieve a memory, an image of that person from your memory. And this image seems to have appeared from nowhere. And again, this is an example of how a phenomenon can manifest, can arise from your mind.
但通常我们可能不会觉得这个是我心变现的那我们这一个我们处处我们比如说我看到像我前面有一只电风扇有一张桌子那肯定我必须要用我记忆中的电风扇那记忆中的桌子至少我看到电风扇看到桌子我必须要用我记忆中的桌子跟电风扇来核对那这样的话我才能够看到桌子跟这个电风扇
Perhaps we don't feel that everything is created by the mind, but look at the example in front of us. Look around, whatever that you're seeing. For me, right in front of me is a fan and a desk. When I see the fan and the desk, I have to retrieve all the associations or memories of fans and desks from my memory. And then I will match my memory, whatever I retrieve from my memory, with the object that is perceived by my eye in front of me. And once these two can match up, then I know what I'm looking at. And we call that seeing.
那这个其实我们处处我们是每天应该是每分每秒我们都必须要借助我心中的记忆来判断眼前所看到的一般人叫到什么投射那从楞严经来讲就是你变现的其实是你心变现出每天叫做投射那一般的经典可能说我们佛法重点可能是不再探讨 在探讨它怎么变现的，而是说我们这些从心中冒出来或者我们拉出来的这些人事物啊，最主要是人啊。那一般经典都在探讨它这个不是人啊，因为这个就是一个影像啊。那在修行面啊，佛法在修行面的话，可能就是要说啊，你把那个一个影像啊，当成人啊，那楞严经就不是这样子啊，但楞严经不只是讲这样子而已啊。
So at everywhere we look and every second, every minute of the day, we are relying on our own memories in our mind that's restored in the mind, or all these associations that's stored in the mind. We rely on them to identify and to make sense of the stimuli that we encounter, that we perceive by our sensory organs. And lay people call it projecting our thoughts onto whatever we experience. And in the words of Surangama Sutra, we call it's manifested by the mind, from the mind. In other sutras, oftentimes these concepts are explained as whatever we encounter, all phenomena that's emerged from our mind, people, things. These are not actual people. Sutras explain that they are merely phenomenon and images that arise from our mind. But the Surangama, so that's in principle. But on the level of practice, what we need to do is we need to understand that we mistakenly treat those phenomenon as real people, real object. And what we need to do is to remind ourselves that they are not people, they are not objects. But the Surangama Sutra actually goes even further than that.
那楞严经在讲这个部分啊，那这跟我们的修行啊，或说人死了，或是人来投胎哈，那从楞严经的角度来分析，就比较清楚了哈。
And from the Surangama Sutra's perspective, then we can, using the phenomenon of a person dying and then getting reborn into another life form, we will be able to see how the inner working of this concept that everything is manifested by the mind a lot more clearly.
那尤其是像我们知道，我们说人啊，我们就以色身来讲哦，我们这个色身是四大组成的嘛，那死的时候，那我们这个四大就分解啊，那四大的分解，那可以讲说跟楞严经的这种次第是完全一样的哦。我们楞严经是讲说这个四大，先出现的时候是先风大，我们这边叫做什么？先风大，我们之前讲说什么？上次讲的12个字嘛，无明能所，然后虚空世界，众生业果。那虚空世界，先虚空，然后再世界啊。那我们今天讲那个世界，那第一个先是虚空出来以后，接下来是风大，那接下来是地大，那接下来是火大啊，还有水大啊。那我们身体就是这几个组成的。那当我们的死的时候，我们最后我们就可以化解最后离开的是风大，还有一个是火大，那应该是风大只要风大不见了以后，那又回到空大就在我们的人死了以后，你大家可以化解，就是什么四大分解是这样的次第。
With regard to our physical body is a aggregate. It's composed, a composite of the 4 elements: air or wind, earth, fire, and water. And when people are, when people pass away, when they die, the four elements decompose. And when they decompose, this decomposition actually follows the same sequence as the way that the world is formed, as explained in the Surangama Sutra. The sequence is very similar. Earlier, we have mentioned, we have explained how the world came about by going through the sequence of delusion, leading to subject and object, and then to space, to the world, sentient beings, and karma. Today's focus is on the world. And the world, when it's first formed, the sequence is the air first arises, and then comes earth, fire, and water. And when our physical body decomposes, when we die, it follows the same sequence, but in reverse. So the last to go is the air, the wind. And then when the air and wind goes, then we return to empty space. So the sequence for both the world as well as the physical body is the same.
那好像是一个是我们的身体啊，就是瓦解的时候，那最后就回到虚空。好像我们这个世界啊，我们也叫什么成住坏空啊，好像就是变成坏掉以后，就最后就回到虚空，大概也是跟我们身体这样的一个瓦解差不多。大概可能什么说什么要瓦解的时候，有什么风灾啊，有什么水灾啊，有火灾啊，那到最后就坏掉了，会回到虚空。
So when our physical body decomposes, at the end, when the air goes, the element of air is gone, then we return to space. Same to our world. The world goes through cycles of coming to being, existing, being, sustaining, decay, and then eventually disintegration and emptiness. So in the sutra, many sutras explain that when a world is coming to an end, there will be a series of events that's related to wind, disaster of wind, of water, flooding, as well as fire. And similarly, with the world, when air, the element of air decomposed, then it returns to the empty space. So the two show parallel, the physical body and the world.
那一个就是我们就是说世界是什么？我们叫它有那个什么成住坏空哦，是个过程哦。那我刚才讲说我们人就是要败坏的时候，就是什么？最后是什么？应该是火大啊，就是风大啊。风大这也是一个火大，火大最后就等于是你的身体最后可能就是开始渐渐冰冷了，那最后是什么？那火气不见了哈，那就什么就败坏了哈，那跟这个世界啊的那种就是毁坏是一样的哈。
For worlds, they go through cycles of coming to being, existing, decaying, and emptiness. And for human beings, when the physical body decays, the last to go are the element of fire, and finally the element of air, wind. With the element of fire leaving, and people's body gradually, the temperature goes down, and after that, the element of air will decompose, and that's when people breathe their last breath. And then after that, everything returns to space, to empty space. And again, the two processes, world and physical body, they're parallels.
那在我们的等于是我们的身体啊，我们说是四大组成的嘛， 那外在的世界也是由四大组成的那我们现在就是因为我们把生理大部分的时间是把生理当成我，那这个生理是四大组成的那外在的也是四大组成的那在阿含经他没有讲到他们没讲到那么细，但是会讲到投胎那我们这个心识怎么进入我们这个等于是这母胎里面去那他们四大有没有讲那么清楚？不太清楚也就是说我们这一个就是胚胎或者卵子精子，它本身就是四大组成的。
The physical body is made up of 4 elements, and the world similarly is also made up of 4 elements. But we mistakenly take our physical body as the self, often forgetting that it's a composite of the 4 elements. And then there's also the world that's external, in addition, outside of the physical body. And that it is also made up of the 4 elements. In the Agama Sutra, there's detailed explanation of how sentient beings get reborn, how the consciousness enters a mother's womb. And I'm not sure whether in the Agama Sutra they gave as clear of an explanation of the 4 elements as in the Surangama Sutra. That I'm not clear about. But we do know that even the female egg and sperms, they're also composite of the 4 elements.
对我们来讲我们现在一个四大的身体那我们这个我们说我们中医或者我们中国人常讲说什么四大调和，那也是我们都是会保持在一种四大调和。像现在有疫情，对不对？那你可能就生病的时候，你就发觉可能这个四大就是不调了，可能很冷很热或是什么就呼吸很急躁，那就是等于是四大不调。那我们平常我们的心识就让这个四大调和。
And so the physical body is made up of the 4 elements, and that's the Chinese herbal medicine. The doctors working within that framework also follow this principle, and talk about how the 4 elements must work together in harmony. So let's take the pandemic that we are facing right now. When people get sick, the 4 elements become out of sync, and people may have a fever and feel cold, or the temperatures go up, or they experience shortness of breath. Those are all because of the 4 elements have gone out of sync with each other. They're no longer harmonious. And the harmony of the 4 elements is actually what made the 4 elements work in harmony is because of our mind. The mind created the harmonious interworking of the elements.
好，我们讲那么多，我想我们现在应该是开始进入主题那刚才讲的最主要是说我们的心变现这个世界那现在我们开始讲这个世界的那个就是宏大它是怎么样由心变现的
We have said a lot, but those are all still just preface and basically explaining why everything is created by the mind. And now we're going to zoom in to talk about the continuation of the world more specifically.
那我们可能还再复习上次一下，就是说我们的心性原先什么都不是就是像虚空一样，但是它是什么不生不灭那具有感知的一种功能我们叫做这两者就两个主要成分只要两个特质就是什么，我们通常叫什么叫空灵，或是极而常照空灵 就是它就像虚空，可是它有那种见闻觉知中的功能哦，就是原先我们的心，或者说不是讲说原先，我们事实上我们任何时间都处在这种空灵的状态啊。
A quick review, the mind that creates everything. And what are the characteristics of the mind, this mind, the true mind, that it's not anything. It doesn't take on any form, or it's not any specific object or thing or concept. It's nothing. At the same time, it's everything. And another characteristic is that it neither arises nor perish. Yet, so it's like the empty space, yet it can perform the function of perceiving and awareness. So a phrase that we commonly evoke is that it's a wondrous emptiness. It's wondrous that it can illume and it can see, hear, and be aware, yet itself is of no particular form. It's empty and devoid of any fixed characteristics. And also another phrase that goes to explaining the function of the mind is that it's quiescent at all time. At the same time, it has the ability to illume, to perceive and be aware. And this is our true mind, and it functions this way at all times, even right now.
然后我们今天讲说，我们就最初一念妄动嘛，然后就产生能手啊，那能手就是接下来就产生第一个是产生虚空，那这个虚空，可以用这个上次我们讲说，用跟自己下棋的老人，或是用咸火轮来比喻啊。
And because the mind had, it moved because of delusion, then the duality arises, duality of subject and object manifest. And when that manifests, then space is created. And this space is different than the one that we mentioned earlier. This space is akin to the analogy that you're familiar by now is the old man who is playing chess with himself. Or another analogy I use is the twirling fire, a ring of fire that came about by moving the speck of light really quickly. So that's space is created that way.
那一个，我们先用咸火轮呢？咸火轮就是一根在晚黑夜当中，你用一根香哦，燃烧的香啊，点燃的香，那你画一个圆圈啊，那你就发觉就有个圆圈留下来，事实上那个圆圈已经消失了啊。那这个圆圈，其实它就是那根香，它都是有那根香啊。比如说一根香有60点，画一个圆有60点，那每一点都曾经是那一根香啊，但是它已经消失，我们觉得它还在啊。那这个就是虚空就这样出来了。
So let's go a little bit more in detail with a fire ring example. So when it's dark, we light an incense, and on the tip of the incense is a speck of light. And then so we hold the incense and draw circles in the air. And into our eyes, there seems to be a ring of fire, a light circle that manifests in midair. Let's break it down even more, that circle of light is actually made up of, for instance, 60 points of light. And every point had once been the tip of the incense of the light. But except that after passing, that point has already vanished. It has perished. but we still see the light. That's because of residual effect of the eye, that we still see that there seems to be a ring of circle. Whereas those specks of light has already arisen and perished already. And so there's really no circle.
那我们刚才说那根香，实际上就是我们的空灵哦，我们就是我们的佛性哦，那我们叫真空妙的真空哦，它无相，像虚空一样，只是它有什么？有见闻觉知的功能。那它用来，如果那根香代表我们的空灵的心，那它转一圈，那个等于是那个圆圈已经消失了，那就相当于就是已经消失的那个什么空寂的心，或是空灵的心。那我们叫做消失了，你觉得它还在，就变成一个什么，就是空灵的心。但是它因为消失了，所以它没有觉知，我们叫做亡空嘛。那虚空就这样出现的。
And let's take that tip of the incense, the speck of light, as our true mind. It's empty yet wondrous. It can illume and can perceive and aware, and it doesn't exhibit any particular form. So when that speck of light goes through the air, it's always just one point in time. One thought arises and one perishes. There is really no circle. But because we perceive that there is a lingering effect, a residual effect of the light. So we mistakenly think that the circle is still there. And so that speck of light represents our true mind, whereas the circle that it's not there, but we think it is, that is this kind of space that we're talking about here. The space, a stubborn, a static, empty space that arises from the dualistic mindset.
然后这个我们也可以用那个什么跟自己下棋的老人解释就是你在自己的位置先下一步棋，那再跑到另外一个位置再回一步，那再回过来自己那总而言之，从头到尾就只有一个老人，但是我们那个跟自己下的老人就变成两个人了。那因为这个老人还是有相的，如果这个老人是一个无相的，那跟那个刚刚一样，那个消失的那个老人就叫做虚空，也是一样的，就是说能知的假如老人在这个位置，在他自己的位置，那他是真空，那被他感知的那一个已经消失的老人，那就是叫做亡空。
So the old man that's playing chess with himself, it's the same. This old man across the chessboard is playing the game with himself, and he moves from one position to the opposite position. And so back and forth, and over a period of time, it creates the delusion that there is actually a person at the opposite end, that there are actually two people playing, and that this is because of the residual effect of, there's a residual effect, and not knowing that there has always just been one. That one, we can think of that old man, that one old man is our true mind, who can perceive and can see. And the delusion of the other person is the empty space, that kind of static empty space that has already perished, but because of a deluded understanding, we think that it's still there. So this story can also explain the arising of space.
那接下来就是说，你这一个虚空就是已经消失的空性就变成亡空，那也叫做亡空就它没有见闻觉知的能力，因为它已经消失了本来是真空， 接下来就是王空，王空这边叫做空灭。那我们能够感知的真空，就是能够感知的空性啊，既有见闻知的空性跟已经消失的王空再继续互动啊。那这个他们叫相待成爻，就是你不断的跟它互动，那就有风轮，等于是有风大产生的啊，那来维持这个世界啊。
So these are two opposite concepts. There's a true emptiness, which is the true mind, and then there's this static, stubborn, spatial kind of emptiness. So the true emptiness, the true mind can perceive, and it's the subject. And then the empty space, the stubborn one, it's a phenomenon that was created by the mind. It has already perished. And so from the subjective view of the true mind and the objective view of the space that is perceived but has actually been perished, these two they continue to interact with each other. So this is related to the text here. Once a light of understanding is added to enlightenment, the darkness of the primary element space appear, and the interaction of these two complements generate a disturbance in the mind. And this is how the element or the disk of wind is created.
那我刚才讲说，我们那个显火轮啊，显火轮是一个圆圈嘛，那可以讲说你的心，你的心一直在动啊。那动荡的话，基本上就是风大。那动荡的话，你可以画一个圆圈，也可以画一个八字形，也可以画一个三角形。那不同的形状可能就会变成这些世界，但是它的共同点都是动，就是动的哈。我们叫做什么？叫做在我们前面有一个叫什么？叫做世界啊，就是所有的东西都是从风大组成的哈。
And so earlier, that ring of fire the example I gave you is in the shape of a circle. And basically it arises because the mind is moving. And the moving mind creates, the disturbing mind creates wind. And you can use this mind to make a circle, to make a figure 8, or to make the shape of a triangle. So all these different shapes, when add them together and in composites, it becomes the world. And common characteristics of all these shapes and forms, they're all moving. And so they're all related to the element of wind.
那一个人讲，就是像我们常会听到说什么八风吹不动哦，其实这一个我们什么嗔曦毁意，对不对？它是不同的现象嘛，可是他把它称为八风，其实都是我们的心在动哦，所以把它叫做八风。
And there's a well-known poetry, and one of the verse is unmoved by the 8th wind. And this sentence, this line is related to this element of air.
那这个你的心啊，不断的就是结明空昧，就是说你的有能手的心啊，那跟已经消失的王空，那就已经消失的那个结明的心叫做可能是王空哦，就是本来都是真空，但是你动荡的心，那跟已经消失的动荡的心，两个一来一往，那就产生什么？产生空大哈。
And so this mind, the deluded mind, keeps moving. The deluded mind that's operating with subject and object, it moves and it perceives the stubborn empty space, the phenomenon. And so which is also a moving phenomenon. And so the mind keeps moving from the position of the subject and the object, going back and forth. And this movement, this interaction of the two, the subject and the object, creates the element of wind.
这个什么，这个风大那我们就是什么，就是来回，然后产生风大，风大以后，那接下来就是我们的经验就是说我们现在有四大嘛，四大那一个风大先出来以后，接下来后面的就是什么，就是金宝，甚至可以相当一般来讲叫地大不过这边是又把这个地大分成什么金宝草木那这个等于是物质的东西这个金宝可以讲说物质的东西，那它是怎么跑出来的呢就是说我们因为有虚空有顽空，那就跟它互动，然后就产生动荡。接下来后面的坚明利爱彼金宝者明节利坚这个部分就相当于如果是用我们的什么，用我们的我们曾经我们有在东初禅寺有举办过，在台湾也有举办过那个夜光禅意就是观这个月亮那你去取这个月亮的那个像，刚开始在观的时候，我们就发现这个月亮可能忽大忽小，忽有忽无那如果你的心可以一直去什么取这个月亮的像，让它不动的话，那到时候你就会发觉就是一个什么，有一个不动的月亮就出现在你心中了那这个相当于坚明利爱。
So the mind that moves back and forth between the position of subject and object, it creates the element of wind. And then from the element of wind, moving on to, because the element of wind has come to being, then the next gives rise to the element of earth. Usually when we talk about the four elements, we said the word we use is earth. But over here, in the sutra, the term used is the disk of Vajra. That is referring to solidity. And so this passage is basically explaining how the material world comes into being from space and from wind. At CMC and also in Taiwan, we have held a one-day retreat. It's called Moonlight Retreat. And Moonlight Retreat is, we experiment with this practice where you try to visualize the moon in your mind and try to contemplate that. And in the beginning, when people first started, when you try to visualize the moon in your mind, the moon changes. It's wavering. Sometimes it's big, sometimes it's small. It's not a very steady moon. And it comes in and goes out. But if you continue the practice and you keep focusing on this image of the moon, gradually over a period of time, the moon becomes firmer in your mind, and it no longer changes shape, and it stays constant in your mind.
那个坚明利爱，那个坚就是重复那在《楞严经》有讲到，就是说这个物质物质就是坚固妄想，就是你不断的重复，你的念头不断的重复，那物质就会出来了。就像现在的他们一直在讲，在争论说什么这个我们做那个什么量子力学，量子本身是什么？他们说它是波动，那有些人说它是物质那事实上从这一个楞严经的角度，就是你的心不断的什么波动，不断的动荡，那一直重复的动荡，那它就是一个什么一个动荡的状态 那因为是一直重复，所以就变成一个什么，一个很实体的一个东西的，就像晚上我们做梦我们就梦到，比如说梦到墙壁，那对我们来讲，我们不会觉得这个墙壁是生灭的但是事实上它什么，你只要什么醒来的话，墙壁马上消失，因为它就是什么，我们重复不断的重复出现的一个妄念，那就产生障碍，那就等于是什么，这个金宝就是这样子形成的。
In this passage, there is this word firm, firm attachment. Firm can also be interpreted as it's repeated, repetition. So there's a phrase that we use, it's called repeated wandering thoughts, repeated deluded thinking. And so because of delusion, there's subject and object, and the mind is constantly moving, going back and forth. And this process is repeated over and over again. And from that, solid objects or materials arises. So it's the relationship between movement and substance. So that's why in quantum physics, I think they go through debates. The debates goes back and forth whether it's wave-like or whether it's a static status. And so this is kind of corresponds with what is talked about, explained in the sutra, that there's a movement and repetition and that will result to the coming to being of solid object. So let's take our dreams, for instance. When we're dreaming, these thoughts keeps arising. So if we dream of a wall, in the dream, we don't feel that it's something that will arise and perish. To us in the dream, it feels like a solid object. But as soon as we wake up from the dream, the wall is gone. And so the solid object and materials are actually manifestations of the mind.
像我们现在我的电脑这边，我们有一些字嘛，那我们会觉得那些字就好像就是什么，就停留在那边嘛。其实它是什么？它可能是每秒钟然后就是什么，用这个什么，用电子出现出现，大家听说好像现在是21次。那你就不断的同样的出现的话，那这边你就会觉得一个实质的一个文字一些文字就在那边不动，所以就像这个就等于是什么，就变成什么，就变成金宝
So for instance, looking at the monitor in front of us, the words, the characters that's on my PowerPoint, it may appear to be fixed, to be stable, but that is really not the case. They are there as because of projections of light on the screen by the monitor. And I don't know what is the newest figure. I think maybe 210 million times a second or a minute. So it's repeatedly projected onto the monitor. And that is why to us, our eyes feels like it's a stable character writings on the screen.
所以说这边这个等于是金宝嘛，就等于是就是我们这个物质，就是你不断的什么重复，不断的用心去重复，或者说就是说像那个什么，像说我们说用鲜肉人不断的一直画，你这个不断的画，那就有一个圆圈就一直在那边那这个就是什么煎饼，就是你假如你一个画，或者说我们这一个荧幕，对不对？你出现21次，那你就画了有一个什么一个固定的东西在那边的，那就是你就等于是不断的重复，然后就产生一个障碍那你不断的重复，然后就力坚，那就变成就是什么，就变成一个非常坚固的，能够让它一直什么变成就是非常坚固，不可破坏所以这两者可以讲说，就是用我们的心重复的什么去感知，重复的感知， 所以说在我们你看在我们的修行的时候，只要我们的心能够不去感知一个对象，那我们这些世界还有身体全部都会消失。我们叫做什么？在禅修叫做什么？大地落成，然后虚空粉碎。
So essentially, the coming to being of materialistic world is because the mind keeps repeating the same process continuously, incessantly. And that's how materialistic beings arises from this repetition of the mind moving, going back and forth. Similar to the ring of fire, if you continue to draw that circle in midair at night, it's going to appear that the circle is fixed, that it's staying there. And same thing with the words on the monitor, with so many repetitions, it seems to the eye as they're fixed. So again, this word firm solidity is actually referring to this concept of repetition, repeated, going back and forth. So the world comes to being because we use our mind to keep repeatedly to illume, to be aware of the phenomenon. So when we're actually practicing, in our practice, if we can try to achieve the state where the mind is not focused on any particular object, the mind is not contacting or not illuminating any particular object, then that's when the external world and the physical body will cease to exist. And in Chan, the phrase that we use is that the world has fallen away and empty space shatters. That's when the mind is no longer coming into contact with phenomenon.
金宝呢出现有接下来我们就是风大就是什么风大就是什么就是火大刚才是先风大，就是跟空大，那接下来是风大，那接下来是什么？金宝应该可能是地大，接下来是火大那坚结宝成，遥明风出，然后风金相磨，故有火光为变化心这里面可以讲说我们的心就是我们的经验嘛，比如说我们用什么，用我们的手两只手相摩擦那就是什么？你的一个是摩擦的是属于风那我们的身体是属于什么宝嘛所以两者摩擦就产生热所以就可以讲说这是为什么有这个火大跑出来。
So after the coming to being of empty space comes air, wind, and then comes fire, comes solidity, earth, the element of earth. And then what comes next is the element of fire. And the text reads, thus the disc of Vajra is generated from the firm attachment to the added understanding. And the disc of wind is generated from the disturbance arising from the interaction of the two complements. The light of the added understanding and the darkness of mental space. From the friction between the disc of wind and the disc of Vajra, there arises the element of the disc of fire, which is characterized by changeability. So we can use a common experience to illustrate. If you put your two hands together and you rub them, then heat, if you rub them repeatedly, quickly, heat is generated. So the rubbing movement is, we can see that as the element of wind. Our physical hand is the element of earth, of solids. And when the two come into interact with each other rapidly, heat is generated.
所以前面讲说间接跑成，就是说我们不断的重复不断的一种重复我所感知的东西，那就金宝就出成了。然后我再跟他互动，那就遥明不断的你去这一个什么 持续来来回回的，那就风带就出来了。那风跟金风跟就是风跟等于是地大，这边风金那相摩擦，那火光就能够变化性。像我们有没有？我们有时候在像我们每天在那个洗那个什么，我们比如说吃东西，然后里面有就煮东西那里面脏的东西，你一直摩擦，然后这个脏的或是那一个什么淋在锅的那些米饭那就能够什么，能够擦起来了。
So over here, there's this word firm again. That's again referring to repetition. When you use your mind to repeatedly illume any particular phenomenon, that gives rise to the element of earth, to solids, materials. And then and the movement of the mind from the subject mind of illuminating to the phenomenon that's being illuminated, that creates wind. And so over here, the disk of wind is generated from disturbance arising from the interaction of the two complements. And then from the interaction of wind and solids, then it gives rise to the element of fire. So let's say when we are in our daily settings, when we are washing our clothes or when we are washing the dishes, again, with repeated rubbing of the cloth or repeated scraping of the bowl, we can get rid of the dirt on the clothes as well as the stuck rice balls on the wall of the bowl.
那火大出现以后，接下来是水大水大这边宝明生润，那火光上正那故有水轮寒死亡界那我们刚才讲说，这个世界都是什么？都是由这个地水火风，就是不同的什么组合而形成的。
Next, we'll turn to the coming to being of water, the element of water. The text reads, moisture arises from the shining of the disk of Vajra and turns to vapor in the presence of fire. Thus, the disk of water comes into being and encompasses the worlds in the 10th direction. So together, the four elements explains how the world comes to being.
这边的这个宝明生论我还是不知道怎么样去解释其实我看了很多注释，大家好像也讲不清楚那我刚刚想到，就是这个明就是我们的佛性就是我们佛性有那个明的功能。那你本身它因为像我们就讲到说水水它没有一定的形状，你把它合起来比如说你把一堆水合起来，还是变成等于是一潭水，那你把它分开，那就是也可以变成几千的水滴那跟我们的那个佛性也是一样佛性譬如你的佛性我们的佛性，我100个人加在一起，基本上也是一个佛性。那我们把它分开，可能可以1000个、10000个也可以，所以它大概有这种功能，就保明大概这种特质。
This first part of the verse, moisture arises from the shining of the disk of Vajra. I'm still not able to explain this verse very adequately, and I have studied from many commentaries, and I don't think any of them really explained it very well either. So as I was mulling over this, I think perhaps this, the word shining over here, maybe we can relate that to our Buddha nature and this is an illustration of the function of our Buddha nature in the sense that water doesn't take on any particular form. So we can have a bunch of water put together, then you get a pool of water, or you can separate all these water into dewdrops, and these are hundreds of drops of water. And similarly, Buddha nature, a characteristic of Buddha nature is like that. When you put 100 Buddha natures together, it's one Buddha nature. But when you separate them into thousands and 10,000s, you have all these numbers of Buddha nature, each performing its functions of illuminating. So perhaps we can sort of try to gauge at the meaning of this verse by comparing that with our understanding of characteristics of Buddha nature, that it's devoid of any particular form.
那这边地水洪就已经形成了，那它整个全部都是什么？都是新的一个什么？我们讲到新的一个波动吧，新的一种，就是说有感知而形成的一种，就生生灭灭的一个功能。那不同的比例，然后就变成什么？就变成地水火风。但它最主要就是什么？大概有2个因素，就是什么？我们的心不动的心，然后你一直要去感知，变成有对象的感知。那这样的话，形成风大以后就是应该可能是空大，也算是风大那这一个这样子的一个什么，就是生生灭灭的就是说你不断的重复的就不同的那种特质，就产生我们的地水火风。
So these verses basically explain the coming to being of the 4 elements, which then together creates the composite of the 4 elements becomes our world. And when it boils down, the 4 elements, these are all movements, vibrations, movements of the mind. That the mind that has the ability to illume and to be aware. And because the mind moves, thus creating the appearance of the arising and ceasing of phenomenon. And the 4 elements, wind, fire, earth, and water, they are merely the movement of the mind that is of different weight. So different compositions of that becomes a particular element. But the bottom line is there has initially been a mind that is unmoving, but the mind, because of delusion, wanted to feel that there is an object that it illuminates. And so this movement, then subject and object, the movement is repeated over and over again. And this gives rise to wind and solids, and then fire and water.
那地水洪生成了以后，接下来不同的比例就形成我们这边后面所讲的海还有这个陆地还有这个什么水还有这是什么？就是草木就是颜色。我们这样看这边下面就是水腾火降，浇花利坚既为思为既来，刚为周淡还是怎么样以是异故，比大海中火光长起，比周南中江河常驻。我们先念到这边。
And the 4 elements coming together, but in different way, different composition, they then created our ocean or the land or the trees and plants. And the text reads, as fire flares up and water descends, their interaction brings about solidity. From the primary element water, the ocean comes into being, while the continent and islands come into being from the primary element of earth. Thus, fire sometimes emerges from the ocean, etc. We'll just end it from here really quickly.
所以这边可以看到就是什么呢？就是什么？就是水跟火这2者的交互作用然后就变成不断的，等于是交互作用，然后同样的模式的交互作用，然后就变成一 一个，比如说我们的海呀，或是我们的这一个陆地的洲，那也可以讲说这些全部，其实说全部都是我们的心的一个什么不同的组合模式的重复。
So we can see here the water and fire, they interact with each other, and the interaction is repeated, giving rise to the ocean. And then different compositions of earth and water then creates the land. So they all boils down to these are all due to the repeated processes of the mind.
所以在后面的话就是什么，一个是什么水火是往上升，那水往下降嘛，那下面的那个什么，这一个水势烈火皆为高山，就是水跟火的比例就是说水比较什么，水可能比较大比较多水的比例多，那火的比例比较少，或者应该是水的比量比火少，就变成高山把那高山水，他讲说这一个什么山上的石头你把它等于是用东西把它像这样加热的话，就变成火焰嘛那就是可能就是什么，你就是要去摩擦的话，就产生像我们叫什么，我们不是就是要什么这个点火的时候，以前就是摩擦那个石头，那产生火焰嘛。那如果说你再加更大的热，然后那这个等于是连石头都会融化成什么，我们叫岩浆
And so furthermore, mountains form when the primary element fire is stronger than the primary element water. Thus rocks gives off sparks when struck and melts when heated. And so with the rocks in the mountain, when you add heat to it, then think of it, when we put two stones together, we struck them together, then it gives off sparks of fire. But then when you increase more heat, then the rocks that melt becomes lava.
接下来就是什么土势烈水就是这边就变成土跟水的比例就土的比例应该是比水少，就变成草木那草木的话就是什么烧的话变成土，那你把它用这个什么把它压榨的就变成水
And next comes to the different compositions of earth and water. And the text reads, vegetation grows where the primary water is stronger than the primary element earth. Thus trees and grasses are reduced to ash when burned and exude when burned. And so the soils comes about when there is less element of earth and more element of water, then vegetation comes about. And when there's extra heat, then it's burned down to ashes. And then furthermore, when there's more water and you compress them, when you compress the vegetations, then you see liquids coming out of it. So that also illustrates that vegetation, part of the composition is the element of water.
那这边可能可以做个总结，也就是说，我们现在看到的有形的物质我们叫虚空世界还包括虚空那它们都是由四大组成的，那么基本上就是什么不同的什么不同比例不同形式的一个妄想那就组成我们这个世界
So we can quickly summarize here that all materialistic phenomenon, all phenomena with forms, including the materials as well as the empty space that's made up of our world, they are all composites of the four elements, and there are composites of elements in different weights.
所以我们现在就讲比较具体一点的就是什么，我们的像我们有人穿墙那也有真正有人他很专注的就是念佛，而且他就走出去了。当他要走回来以后，他发觉不知道是哪一个禅师发觉门是反锁了，也就是说其实这个我们眼前看到的这些墙壁事实上就是妄想组成的那对于那些像对那些临界众生来讲，这边是没有墙的。那对我们来讲，因为我们自己像梦中这样变现出来，我们就觉得是有墙。
So there has been a story of a Chan master who sat in deep meditation reciting Buddha's name. And when the master stood up, trying to go outside, he just actually went through the wall. And afterwards, when it dawned on this person tried to do the same thing again. He couldn't. And then when he checked the door is actually locked from the inside. But he couldn't repeat because he's already out of that meditative state, concentration state. He couldn't walk through the wall again. So this real story shows us that all solid objects that we see and feel in our everyday life, they are actually composites of our wandering thoughts. And that's why for sentient beings, for beings or in the spiritual realms, such as ghosts, to them, there's no wall, and they can just walk right through it. And this is also related to the example I gave earlier of us dreaming. And when we're dreaming, there's a wall. We feel it's solid. And in the dream, we can't walk through the wall. But when we wake up, the wall disappears. So these are all a composite of our repeated wandering thoughts.
所以说，你看，就是说这一些我们像有一些就是像佛陀或是阿罗汉，他们用神通可以比如说把我这个泥土变成黄金那听说就是什么，就是佛陀把它变成黄金他可能可以大概可能几千年或几亿年都是黄金。那有一些阿罗汉可能他就是可能几年以后或几个月以后，那个黄金又会变回来，变成泥土。
And so in the sutra, there are stories where Buddha or Arhats, they use spiritual powers to turn a lump of clay into gold. And for Buddha, that lump of gold can stay gold for thousands or even millions of years. And whereas for Arhat, the duration of their transformation is a lot shorter, maybe just in days or in months, that will transform back to earth, to clay.
那就是说我们总话一句，就是说这个世界实际上就是我们的妄想那不断的一个什么我们就坚固不断的重复这个妄想，那这些东西就会出现。就像我自己以前曾经下棋连续下了3天3天3夜，那我脑袋瓜里面就一直浮出这个棋你也没有要想到会一直浮出来。那我们这个世界大概也是这样子。
So what it boils down is, again, still this concept that our world came into being as a result of our repeated wandering thoughts. The same wandering thoughts repeated over and over again, and it brings. This is how our world manifests. So I have a personal experience where I used to be very into playing chess, and there was this time where I was playing chess for 3 days and 3 nights straight through. And when I stopped, even though I wasn't actively trying to think of chess playing, these thoughts keep emerging from my mind naturally without conscious working. It just keeps emerging. So I think perhaps there's a parallel between my experience and how this world's coming to being, this repetition of the wandering thoughts, eventually leading to solid substances.
好，我们今天就讲到这边，我不知道大家接下来有没有什么问题呢？
We'll stop our today's talk here, and do you have questions?
我就把它停掉。好。哦，这边有人写问题嘛？啊，可不可以这样理解四大？因为四大依因缘生灭产生不同的假象现象，其实并无自性，其的分别心就有相，其实会一会二，可以这么讲吗？
So there's a question that is posted on chat. The question goes, can we understand the four elements this way? That because the four elements arises, the four elements according to causes and conditions, they arise and perish, creating different transient, temporary forms and phenomena. But these four elements actually lack intrinsic nature. If we have differentiating thoughts relating to these phenomenon, then it exists. But in reality, it's neither one and nor two. Is this can we understand the four elements this way? And Fashi's answer is yes, you can.
好，这边还有什么？这是漏这个吸引力法则，是不是也是这样子？是不是下面那一个 BD 啊？是不是也是那一个？
吸引力法 ，OK。So there's another question from another person. Is it the same as the law of attraction?
对，应该吸引力没有错，就是你不同的吸引力上，就是心念的不同的吸引力啊。 上就是心念跟心念的一种交融，就是说，譬如说我看到你，那你基本上是一堆妄想组成的，那我这个妄想跟你是一样的，那就能够什么，就能够整个有互动啊。那如果说我妄想跟你什么的模式跟你不一样，那就是什么，等于是我们怎么你说没有缘啊，千里而来不相见啊，就是对面来不相见。 也看不到，那如果有缘，千里来也会碰到啊。
老师，你刚才说你是一堆妄想组成的，对不对？
对，我们就大家都是一堆妄想，但是就是同类的、同频率的妄想，那就产生吸引力。
So the answer to this question relating to the law of attraction, Fashi's answer is yes, you can say it like that. It's basically interaction of the mind. Every one of us are composites of manifestations of a whole flood of a bunch of wandering thoughts. That's what made us. And when these wandering thoughts, when your wandering thoughts and my wandering thoughts, they overlap, then there's similarities between two people, and then you will interact with each other. Yet, if the wandering thoughts are totally disparate, they are they don't overlap, then this is when we say there are no affinity between two people, and they will stay strangers. So we are all composites of a series of repeated wandering thoughts.
好，那接下来是朱书宽菩萨的。
法师好，可以听到，
可以。
好，那法师想请教一个问题是，有关于我想请问禅定跟空性之间的关系。问题就是说，通常要像禅师们开悟或者是看到这世界是幻的时候，他们的禅定力是怎么样的？我的意思是说，我有听说过要开悟的话，通常是。好像是味道定就够了，可是好像也有一些例子是要更高的初禅或是二禅、三禅、四禅。然后，对，这是一个方面。然后另一个方面就是说，像 禅定力跟那些跟楞严经所讲的，破掉色蕴，然后受蕴、想行识蕴，这些破掉这些不同的蕴，一一照次第这样破下来，跟禅定力之间有什么关系？
好，
谢谢。
So the question is, Fasher, I would like to ask about the relationship between samadhi and empty nature, because I've heard from different accounts that some places says that it's not necessary to be in deep samadhi to reach enlightenment. And there are also other texts that says it's you have to go through stages of the first dhyana and second, third, etc. So what exactly is the relationship between samadhi and the nature of emptiness? And then also in Surangama Sutra, it talks about how you have to break through, cut off, sequentially cut off the five skandhas, the form, sensation, perceptions, volition, and consciousness to become enlightened. So just want to learn more about it and find out the relationships between samadhi and enlightenment.
它主要的是什么呢？就是开悟，就是说我们一般叫做转世成智啊，就是开悟啊。那智就是有对象的啊，有对象的佛性啊，有时候有对象的知，能够感知的知，因为我们的佛性有知的功能，有对象的知，那变成没有对象，就是什么？我们的心都是有对象的攀岩的，那你想办法让这些往外攀岩的心停下来，那你这个没有攀岩的、没有对象的佛性就会呈现我们叫开悟。
So enlightenment, we often say enlightenment is transforming the conscious mind into the mind of wisdom mind. And what that means is our conscious mind is awareness with duality. And we try to transform that into illumination or awareness without this duality. And currently, as in the current state, our mind naturally grasps onto different phenomena. We want to stop that. And once the mind stops grasping onto phenomenon and operating with duality, then that's what we call enlightenment.
那我们一般的禅修就是什么？我们心基本上一般凡夫就是散乱心嘛。那现在先把这散乱心，我们这6根收为一根，那就相当于禅定哦。接下来再把禅定再放掉，那你就开悟。
And when we meditate, basically, our current state is our mind is scattered. And so what we try to do when we sit in meditation is we try to collect these scattered thoughts, and by collecting the 6 sensory organs and gather it into one. And when you let go of the one, then that's when enlightenment is achieved.
也就是说，我们一般就是你把它放掉你所感知的对象，你就开悟。那我们现在散乱心就是你感知的对象就是太多了啊，那就叫散乱嘛。那现在把感知的对象变成一个感知的这样就叫定啊。比如说你念佛，或是你体验呼吸，那把这些感知的对象变成一个对象，接下来再把它放掉，那就开悟。
So essentially, our mind is very scattered. We are attending to all sorts of different objects, and we try to gather that into one. And when we collect it into one object of our illuming, then that's called samadhi. And when you let go of that object, then that's enlightenment.
这样可以吗？
法师，所以它跟禅定力，就是说有些时候味道定，或是
对，
那个有直接关系，或是不一定
有他要到未到立定，他到未到立定，对
，OK， 或是更高也可以这样子，理论上
更高的话，他们要退出来，他就要把它放掉。
所以不能更高。
通常更高的人，他们不愿意放掉，他们要放掉反而很难过。
I see. OK， 谢谢法师。
So,法师未到立是哪三个未到立？
未到地，
未到
地还没有到达初禅的那个未到地啊。
OK，
地上的地，就是异界定呐，异界的定叫未到地定。
Okay, so is also the person in the audience further asks, so is there any direct relationship between a deep state of samadhi and enlightenment?法师's answer is yes, you do need a certain level of samadhi, but it's not necessary to enter a very deep level of samadhi into like the second, third dhyana. For once you have entered samadhi to that kind of state, a very deep samadhi, it becomes another form of attachment. It's hard to let go of. 所以法师到未到地的定就够了，是不是？
对，他一定是到未到地定，
就是欲界的定就够了，不用再进入各个禅天。
对，不必没有那个不需要。
So it's sufficient that your samadhi is in the state of in the realm of forms. It's not necessary to go to the different first and second, third dhyānas for enlightenment.
好，那这里面刚才有人讲说，如果没有同样的，如果没有对象的方法，话头后不知道怎么放掉，其实是默照，或是有一是话头，你本来是心有在抓嘛，那你反问的时候等于是放掉了。
So another question in the chat is, if the method is without object, 法师说话头或默照是没有对象的方法吗？
他这边有讲嘛，没有对象的方法，他们是基本上是什么？是不去碰触对象。他是没有碰，他说怎么放掉？其实他们就是不去碰触对象，就是放掉。
So when you're using the method of Huatou or silent illumination, how do you practice the method of no object? So basically what we are doing using a Huatou or silent illumination in the beginning, we are, there's one object, but when you're asking the Huatou, that is practicing the reversal of that, to practice trying to gauge at without, meditating without an object. That's the art of questioning.
好，观世音菩萨。
法师，阿弥陀佛。法师，今天我听你讲了这个，世界相续就是每两种元素的这个交往发生，对我的触动很大。我就想着我可以，怎样运用在我的日常生活里面。因为在我的日常生活里面，我看到一些与人互动的模式，它的一个轮回和一个不断恶化上升的这么一个模式。那用这个原理的话，就是每一个互动其实都是在交往发生，不断持续。那我下次可以就是不去反应，是不是就可以切断这个轮回了
？So the question is, Fasher, today you talked about the interaction of elements, and it's really helpful for me. So basically, can this same concept be applied to interaction of people? And oftentimes people, when they have disagreement, is that interaction deteriorates. But then based on what you said, there seems to be interaction and repetitions of wandering thoughts. So does it mean that when heated situations arise, we just practice not reacting to them. Would that be the right way of practice?
那一个基本上不是回应，你生活上你还是要回应嘛。问题点就是说，我们跟人家结什么恶缘，基本上也不是跟人家结恶缘，是你把对方当成一个对象，或者说你把心中的这些记忆当中当成对方。最主要是这个部分，你要先什么？先去厘清，或者说把你心中的记忆的东西，你重新组合。
So, in everyday settings, you still have to respond to people. You have to react to it. When we talk about creating bad conditions, what actually happened, the root of it is that with delusion, we treat the memories as a real person. We think of that as as it representing the phenomenon that arises from your mind, the memories as a real person. So the first step is actually you have to look at these memories and try to reconfigure them, to sort them out, to see that the memories is not the real person.
好，我想 Henry Miller。Hello, Henry Miller.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello, Fasher.
Yeah.
My question is, it says that in the sutra, vegetation grows where the primary water is stronger than the primary element, earth, which one can understand in a general way. But when you get into specifics, there are hundreds of different kinds of species of flowers, orchids and lotuses. And there were times when they didn't exist, and there are times when they go extinct. So using this model of the four elements, how does one come to understand all of this differentiation, which seems to have a certain level of standardization? In other words, plants, there are roses from year to year. I mean, of course, they're changing, but that the species continue. So I was wondering what you thought of that.
So how Harry, you're basically asking about how to explain the differentiation, right?
Yeah, that's basically it.
Okay. So 那问题是法师在经文里面有说土是烈水抽为草木，那这一段话就是看起来是我基本上理解它的意思，可是就是当我们在生活上实际应用的时候，草木只是一个通称嘛，其实还有很多不同的，有兰花，有树木啊，有各式各样不同的物种，不同的物种也有不同的新的产生，或者有些物种被灭绝了。那所以这句话怎么样解释这一些分类不同的这些这么更细的这些分别？
我想可能先从人开始嘛，像我们人就是你也是四大组成的，那我们人就有他的一个什么，譬如说他一个人的一个基本的外形嘛，那基本的外形里面你又有什么里面的一个什么基因的什么差别，那称为黑人啊、白人啊，有人比较高啊，有人比较瘦啊，但是他基本上都离不开人的这种有头有脚这样的一个那个造型。
So I guess we can try to use human beings as an example. Human beings are composites of the four elements. All human beings takes on a basic form. We all have head and two arms and two legs. But beyond this basic general form of humans, there are different genetic dispositions. There are people of different colors, or people who are taller, people who are shorter. So there are differentiations among people, even with all subsumed under the commonality of this human shape.
那同样的就是说，比如说蝴蝶啊，可能有 可能有几百种，可是它那一个形状，比如他们会飞啊，对不对？然后造型就是有那个，就是一种什么那种蝴蝶那个形状啊，或者是颜色啊、大小啊，就在这个架构之下，那个人的就像跟人一样啊，在人的架构之下，那你个人的不同的业力，再变成一个什么同中有一些义，我们叫同中有义。那这个义中的话，我们的共同点就是人。
Similar to butterfly, butterflies they all have this basic shape of butterflyness, wings and body. But among them, there are different colors, different sizes. And these differentiation comes about because of different karmic consequences, karma. And so among among the commonalities, there are differences, and with the differences, they are also assumed under this commonality of this form of humanness or butterflyness.
那可能再讲一个比较基本的哈，像我们有一些人有神通或者菩萨菩萨他们就比较厉害的人，他可以变成个人形。变成一个人形，那根据他的需要，那变成不同造型的人。但是呢，这种变化，基本上是要什么？就说这个变化大概可能是3天就不见了啊。那你如果说要长期的等于是什么？比如说变成人有100年的话，那你就要透过这种我们叫做什么？脱胎的这种方式，等于是我们这个精子卵子的方式。那就那一些花草也是一样，他们有一个基本的一个固定的模式，那形成这样的花。那你假设你要就是说能够长期的话，不是变化的哦，你就是在也是那个物种的话，那你就必须根据这样的一个等于是也是我们投胎的方式。否则的话，基本上我们是什么？我们的心是可以变化出各种东西的。
法师，你说花草有投胎的方式吗？
没有，也是花草，他们是受精的嘛，我们是投胎嘛，对不对？就是有精子卵子，那你的神是进去了嘛。那花草他们是什么？他们是什么那个要有那个种子嘛。但是就是说你基本的种子的架构，那你在不同的心识进去就有一点点改变，但是不离那个架构。
So if we bring it down to an even more fundamental level, there are some great bodhisattvas, they can use their spiritual power and transform into different kinds of human beings of different shapes or different types of people. But usually through the use of spiritual power, it doesn't last, maybe for a few days, for a few months. But if you want to stay a fixed form for a longer period of time, for human beings, maybe 100 years, then you have to go through the process of being reborn. And then from that, you gain this physical body that is more stable. Same thing with flowers and plants. For each kind has a fixed patterns of growth, and same thing, it goes through the process of pollination, and then it becomes a more stable forms of certain types of plants or flowers. So the mind itself can change into different forms, but through the process of being reborn, then the form becomes more temporarily more stable.
大家看到，好，我再回答一个那个什么，就是黑里的一个什么，会解脱阿罗汉也要达到味道地定吗？正悟的人想到去死的父母，会有怎样的心境和行为
？So, for this is another question for 法师是会解脱阿罗汉吗？
对，他这边有写。
For liberated arhats, do they also have to reach a state of 法师我不会翻味道地定 a certain samadhi state 证悟的人想到
去死就是父母，去死父母呢
so for people who are enlightened, when they think of the parents who have already passed away, then what kind of thoughts and behaviors would they exhibit? There's a phrase I don't know how to translate. It's a particular state of samadhi.
那慧解脱，其实我们讲说，开悟的人，他们的心不是达到未到地定，就开悟的人的心都是在未到地定。
So, for those people who have become enlightened, it's not correct to say that they have to reach that level of samadhi. We can say, actually, when they reach enlightenment, their mind is in the state of samadhi.
就是说，我们的心境我们的心本身不是定，也不是乱，但是什么？就它什么都不是。那这种状态，它可以产生，比如说讲话的功能比如说我可以什么？骂人什么东西，那他都在这种状态，他这种状态我们把它叫做称到未到地定。
So in other words, the natural state, original state of our mind, it's neither in samadhi nor is it scatter. So it's non-dualistic. It's neither this or that, yet it has it can create all sorts of functions. And that's why we say when people are enlightened, they are in that state of samadhi that is neither a fixed samadhi nor scatterness.
应该讲说，我们开悟的人，他那个定是什么？是没有能所的，应该是他跟慧相应的定的，不是一般讲的说未到地定。可是他很相信，因为跟慧相应的定，它就有种种的功能，可以说话，可以吃饭，就等于行住坐卧都在定当中那跟那个未到地定很像。
So we found Echo provided the translation for that term. It's preliminary ground samadhi. So when people become enlightened, it's very similar that we cannot say that they are in that particular samadhi, preliminary ground samadhi. Instead, we can say their mind is functioning. It exhibits characteristics that's similar to that kind of state, and yet it's able to function.